Welcome all. First of all, I'm very happy to see such a full house in the middle of the summer break. Thank you all for coming. We're very lucky today because we have a very distinguished guest from University of Edinburgh, Juliet Kaarbo. Let me first read her biography. She graduated from University of Oklahoma and then the Ohio State University, MA and PhD studies in 1993. Dr. Kaarbo joined the Politics and International Relations Department of University of Edinburgh in 2011 as a senior lecturer and was promoted to professor with a personal chair in foreign policy in 2015. She served as postgraduate advisor for politics and international relations and is the founding co-director of CSER. Is that how you?
Center for Security Research.
She served as associate editor of Foreign Policy Analysis and the British Journal of Politics and International Relations. Julie previously held posts at the Graduate Institute of International Studies in Geneva and the University of Kansas, where she served as Director of Faculty Programs in the Office of International Programs and as Director of Graduate Studies in the Department of Political Science. In 2009, she was awarded a Visiting Scientist Fellowship by the Scientific and Technological Research Council of Turkey, TÜBİTAK, where she spent a year in this building at Bilkent, Faculty of Economics and Administrative Sciences. In 2018, Julie was named a Distinguished Scholar in Foreign Policy Analysis by the Foreign Policy Analysis section of the International Studies Association. She was elected as Vice President of the International Studies Association for this year, actually, 22-23. In 2019, Julie won the Best Supervisor Award at the University of Edinburgh. Thank you very much for coming, and I'm so happy that we finally have an international academic guest after 3 years of break. Thanks a lot for accepting our invitation.
Great. Thank you very much, Özgür. I'm happy to break that pandemic tradition and be here in person. Really happy to be here. As Özgür said, I spent some time here on this campus, in this building. I got a lot of good work done, met a lot of good people, have fond memories, so it's one of my happy places that I'm always thrilled to return to. So thank you for the invitation, and thank you to the department for hosting this talk. I'm going to talk about a work that's kind of in progress, so it's a good time for me to present it. I don't have final results yet. Those will be forthcoming in a few years, I hope. But it's a good time for me to get kind of your reactions, any questions you have, what's making sense about this, what's not, suggestions for how I should go forward. It's called Breaking Bad, and it's looking at leader personality across time, and I'll unpack all of that for you today. So I have, if you're interested in this idea, I have published a paper in International Affairs last year, and it does basically what I'm going to be doing today, but unpacks it a bit more, talking about the research that I'm drawing on, what my questions are, different ways to conceptualize this topic and think about why leaders break bad in international relations and politics. I've also, this year, published a little blog on the International Affairs website about how we can think about these ideas that I talked about in the framework piece and apply them to Vladimir Putin and the Russian intervention in Ukraine. And I'll talk a little bit about that to end my talk today. So those are follow-ups if you're interested. So I kind of start this idea, this project, with the observation that many leaders serve office for a very long time. We have a lot of examples across history of leaders, and including contemporary times, of leaders being the leader of their country for many, many years. And we know already from international relations research and political science research that leaders are really important. Leaders matter for the politics in their country and for the international affairs, foreign policy of their country. But we know more about snapshots in time, right? We know more, a lot of the research says, here's what a leader's personality, beliefs, here's what leaders' misperceptions might have been at this given time, and this is how we can understand why they did what they did in this particular decision or this particular policy. We don't know that much. There's a little bit of research that I'll talk about today, but we don't know that much about what happens to leaders and their personalities the long time, during the time that they serve. And modern personality theory in psychology tells us that we're not static personalities. All of us change throughout our lifetime. So why wouldn't leaders, who after all are humans too, also undergo some changes? So the snapshots that we have are not necessarily the whole picture. And even leaders that aren't in office for a very long time compared to some of these other leaders, they may change too, even during a short span of a few years. Things may happen in their personal life, things may happen in their governing life that change the way they interact with people, that change the way they think about things, and that those then have consequences for politics and foreign policy. So I am interested in this question, the general question, just how do they change over time, right? What changes can we see when leaders serve for years after years, and especially those longer serving leaders? But I'm also particularly interested in a particular type of change, and that's a very negative change, a darker change in leader personalities. When and how did they become more distrustful over time? When do they become really overconfident, arrogant, maybe more authoritarian in their practices, more insulated? Who gets drunk on power over time, and how does that affect their policymaking and policies? And maybe I'll get to the question of which types of leaders are more susceptible to this negative pattern, which I'm calling breaking bad. So maybe some of you have heard the quote from Lord Acton that power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Great men are almost always bad men. I don't take that extreme view, and I'm not just looking at leaders that have absolute power, but focusing on that. When can power corrupt leaders, and when can it lead them to bad policies, bad leadership? So we have to unpack some of these concepts that I'm throwing out here. First of all, I take a very broad definition, at least initially, of what I mean by leader personality. Right? I want to think about their beliefs, their cognitions, their emotions, what motivates them to govern, their interpersonal relationships and how they handle that, kind of anything and everything, at least at this point in the project, I'm interested in when I talk about leader personality. We also have to think about what we mean by bad, because that can become very tricky. As people, as voters, as citizens, we may be biased in who we think are bad leaders and who we think are good leaders. People disagree about who might be a good leader for their country and who might be doing bad things for their country. We don't, as analysts, as researchers, as students, we kind of want to get away from that bias and be much more specific about what we mean by bad. And I'll talk about more of what I mean by that in a minute. We also want to be careful because not all people are bad all the time. Right? The study of political leaders started with the goal of identifying who are the good personalities that would make good leaders. But that project kind of failed because they quickly found out that, well, leaders can change once they're in power, so just because they had good personality traits going into that may not continue. But they also found out that what's good about some personalities in one context may not fit in another context. So we have to think about bad as a context, and even really bad leaders might occasionally do good things. So when I use the term bad, I want to use it in a fairly specific, extreme way. Right? I want to say that they're really extremely authoritarian in their style. They're really extremely insulated in their decision making. They don't just make some mistakes, all leaders make mistakes, but they make patterns of mistakes over and over, and these are getting worse. And I don't want to use the word evil. I don't think that's very helpful to think about leaders. I just want to think of them as extremely bad and making extremely bad policies, like committing atrocities, human rights violations, starting wars that no one really wanted, having lots of corruptions in their state. So those kinds of things that most of us would agree on, right? That those are kind of bad things that we don't want about our leaders. But we all always have to be mindful of being careful not to kind of just throw that term around. What do I mean by breaking? Well, breaking is really just any change. And at this point, I'm interested in all kinds of change that may happen over a leader's time, because, as I said, we don't really know much about that. So I'm interested in change that can come slowly over a long period. I'm interested in breaking bad at the very beginning. Maybe something happens at the beginning of a leader's tenure. I'm interested in basically kind of any kind of change that might happen during the time a leader rules. And for Game of Thrones fans, I don't know if that's still, Game of Thrones is kind of old now, if everybody's going to get this or not, but I'll assume you do. So I'm interested in the Cersei type of Breaking Bad, which is pretty bad at the beginning and just got worse and worse and worse. And the Khaleesi kind of Breaking Bad, which seemed pretty good leader, and spoiler alert, until last season when things got awful. So anyway, right now I'm interested in all kinds of patterns of breaking bad, and I hope to discover different ways that leaders break bad and why. So to do this, I'm drawing on 4 areas of research about leaders that haven't looked at this question directly but still have something to say. And one is on leaders and people and aging and the effects of that on experience, on learning, and on psychological effects of power. So in terms of age, we all age. Usgur was kind enough to call out the year I got my PhD, which was a long time ago now, so I age. And as we age, we go through different life transitions, and so do leaders. So leaders may be in power when they go from young adulthood to middle age. They may have a middle life crisis when they're a leader. They may face an old age transition. And there is some good work on that leaders that are very old often are thinking about their own mortality and thinking about the policies that they're making as a way to leave a legacy, a way to leave their stamp on history. So we want to think about that kind of age-related psychology when we think about leaders over time. With age, unfortunately, comes more susceptibility to certain diseases and pathologies. Not all old people get these, but this has been the depressing reading of this project. A lot of us, as we age, will at least become somewhat cognitively impaired. And we have a lot of very old leaders that may or may not have these kinds of impairments, but other age-related diseases, cancer, alcoholism, paranoia, and dementia, all of those are more likely, not deterministically, but more likely to happen as leaders age. And we do have good anecdotal evidence and some good historical evidence that these kinds of things have affected leaders in our past. So that's kind of the things I want to look at when I think about age and leaders over time. The second area of research is experience. And by experience, I mean on-the-job learning. So some leaders come with a lot of experience in governance and maybe in foreign policy. Some leaders become less. I'm not talking about that here. Here I'm talking about once they're in office, how does on-the-job learning and understanding their role change the way they do things, change their personality, perhaps. And there are good things about experience. You may know what kinds of questions to ask. You may You may know the norms and the rules of how to govern and do things. But we also know that there are some negative things that can happen when people gain more experience in the job. And one thing that happens is they become less fox-like and more hedgehog-like in their thinking. And don't ask me why we call them foxes and hedgehogs, but foxes are ones that pay attention to details and really want to see the nitty-gritty, the details of the situation. Hedgehogs, and this happens when people get more experience in a particular position, are the ones that are more top-down thinking. And so that might be good, but it also means that they fit new experiences to their past experience, right? They think they know things, and they don't look at the details where the details might be different. They just kind of make this new situation fit into what they already know, and they may be more confident because they have that experience, that they know what this new situation is. Leaders who are more experienced often tend to get more involved in decision-making and policy-making, not all of them, but they tend to do that. That might be a good thing, but it also means it might be a more insular type of decision-making situation, groupthink types of phenomena where there's premature closure on options may happen the more experienced the leader is. The third area of research that I draw on is on learning. So this is kind of like experience, but I mean something different here. It's about how leaders' beliefs change. And there are a few studies that we have that have looked at leaders at time 1 and time 2, and for most of that research, for those leaders with that temporal comparison, we do see that they tend to move in a particular direction. They tend to move from seeing the world as more cooperative to more conflictual. We also see leaders thinking that they can control events around them and control their environment more between time 1 and time 2. So that may be a learning, a belief change that happens with leaders. That's about the content of the belief, but we can also think about how their beliefs are structured, mainly in terms of how simple are their belief systems. Are they very black and white? Are they very rigid in their belief systems? Or are they more complex and see the shades of gray in a situation? And here again, too, there's a few studies that indicate leaders tend to go from more complex thinking to more simplified thinking from time 1 to time 2. Now, this box includes a lot of different kinds of research on the psychological effects of power. We do know from some studies on leaders in foreign policy that, again, comparing leaders from different times, that we do see a growing distrust for some leaders. They tend to be more motivated to have power over others and control the situation, and their confidence and self-esteem tends to rise. And this is encapsulated in a syndrome that Sir David Owen and Davidson talked about as a hubris syndrome. Right? This is ultimate self-confidence, ultimate arrogance. You don't really listen to anybody else, and you think you're thinking, and you think your ideas, and you think you yourself are superior to others. And they've looked at lots of different leaders that have, in history, that have been susceptible to this hubris, excessive pride, and confidence syndrome. But it really mirrors this other type of research that I've become fascinated in that's happening in organizational psychology and business and management psychology. And that looks at people, what happens to them psychologically when they get a position of power, right? Almost at the very moment that they become in a leader position. And that can even be in an informal leader position, as I'm leading this seminar and leading this situation today. And we know from this research that's been going on for a couple of decades that leaders tend to think themselves as entitled to things, that they have the right to be able to do things that they might not have thought before they were leaders. They have more self-esteem, control. They feel superior than others. They tend to rate themselves as taller than others when they didn't do that before they were leaders. they tend to have less ability to empathize and see other people's points of views, become incompetent. It's something that Keltner has called a power paradox. So the paradox is that the very skills and types of personalities that leaders need to become the leaders, maybe in a business or management situation, the paradox is they seem to lose those aspects of their personality once they become in power. Now, this research has not looked at leaders over time, as far as I can tell. It's just at that moment, and they've even done brain imaging and find that your power literally goes to your head, and your brain images start to change once you become named as leader. So Keltner talks about Lord Acton's thesis from that earlier slide, that power corrupts, has been tested and confirmed in lots of different social scientific studies at this point. So those are the 4 areas of research that I draw on, and I don't see these, I'm not interested in saying which one is right, but I'm just saying that all these things, age, experience, learning, and the psychology of power, point into this Breaking Bad direction as leaders rule. So, as I said, I want to be careful of what I mean by badness, and I go into this a little bit more detail in the article, but I talk about badness happening at 3 levels. So you can talk about extreme bad leader characteristics, so extreme distrust, extreme paranoia, extreme insularity. You can talk about badness at the policymaking process, so lots of mistakes, lots of closed door decision making, not considering alternatives, not questioning assumptions. All leaders do this to some extent, but I would be interested in the more extreme levels and a pattern of increasing of these types of mistakes. And then we can think about extreme badness in terms of policies and political outcomes. So things I mentioned earlier, atrocities, human rights violations, corruption, war, crackdowns, things like that. And that my argument is that all these things that I talked about help us, make us expect that some leaders over time will have these kinds of things that we can track and understand why. So we'll approach this with a few different kinds of methodologies. So I can look at leaders, how long they've served, and I can correlate that with bad outcomes like conflict or atrocities or human rights violations using existing data sets. But it's also important, of course, to do kind of in-depth case studies to look at leaders, what's really going on in their daily life as much as we can get that, and what kinds of triggers happened, when did they start to change, and maybe why. Both of these kind of methods will involve profiling leaders' personalities to look at those leaders' characteristics and track them over time. And I won't say too much about this, happy to answer questions later, but one of those profiling methods is leadership trait analysis, pioneered by Margaret Herman, and she's got 7 traits, and the nice thing about these is they really match up with some of those literatures that I'm drawing from that says these are the kinds of things we would expect when leaders happen over time, or when leaders govern over time. And that we've got lots of research on leadership trait analysis and those 7 traits and specific expectations for how leaders' personalities, how those traits affect decision making. Again, I can talk about this more. And that the way we do that is looking at leaders' speeches and interviews, and we have a computerized system for turning their text into these indices that generate some quantitative scores. And the really nice thing for me about this project is that it's not just me saying, oh, this leader's extreme on this trait, or this leader's extreme on that trait. We have a lot of leaders that we can compare them to, and so we know what extreme really means. So as I said, case studies are really important to trace the triggers, the changes, and the effects of those changes in leaders in that kind of tiered system that I presented a few slides ago. I'm not sure which cases I'm going to look at yet, so any suggestions are welcome. I could just look at a bunch of long-serving leaders and see which ones broke bad and which ones didn't. That's one option. I could compare good leaders versus bad leaders and try to figure out why that's the case. My first strategy is probably to go for suspected baddies, right? So ones that we think have changed over time in this particular direction and try to figure out what's happening there and what about their age, experience, learning, and psychology of power may have generated these kinds of dynamics. So one possible case is Vladimir Putin. He was on my mind before February and the invasion of Ukraine, but certainly as I read, as most of you have, I'm sure, about some of the importance of Putin in that decision and also what's happening, what might be explaining about Putin. It seems like a natural case for some of the things that I'm talking about. Right? So Putin's been around for a long time, and because he's so important and has so much power in Russia, there's been some good personality research on Putin. So Stephen Dyson and some of his colleagues have researched Putin quite a bit over the years. And that earlier research found that Putin really was not that different from other leaders in terms of especially his beliefs, right? This research looked at his beliefs. That he seemed to be very pragmatist and opportunist. But some change happened around 2014, especially when he was talking about or thinking about the EU, NATO, and the West. He became a little bit more extreme than he was before 2014. And then others have observed some kind of change in Putin. We also know that Putin, well, I'll get into that in a minute. So French President Macron met with Putin, right before the invasion, and his takeaway, and this was echoed by other world leaders, was that something has changed. He seems more rigid, more isolated. Now, this is all just speculation. I have to do the real research to kind of figure out if this is what's going on. But some of the things I talked about earlier seem to match what Putin watchers, what Russian politics and foreign policy experts seem to be saying. He's not real old compared to a lot of ruling leaders, but he is getting older. And there is some indication that he is thinking about his legacy and thinking about a greater Russia, great power Russia as some aspect of the legacy that he wants to leave. There's lots of speculation that he may have a terminal illness or a debilitating illness. We don't, as far as I can tell, and I've looked around, there's no solid evidence on that. But if that's the case, then that would just exaggerate these kind of poor decision-making and mortality frame that he might have to engage in risky behavior, which is what some see the intervention of Ukraine as. He certainly has gained a lot of experience over the time in governing, and there is some indication that he's changed from listening to a lot of people's views. He used to have 3 or 4 known groups that he would listen to about policy decisions. It's hard to know exactly what's going on in decision-making in Russia, but there's indication that has shrunk quite a bit so that he's very experienced and confident in his own beliefs. As I mentioned, there's actual research that shows that his beliefs have changed, and that we may see some lack of empathy, that he wasn't able to think about the Ukrainians' point of view or the West's point of view and anticipate their reaction. Not many people anticipated how Ukraine and the West reacted to the intervention of Ukraine. There seems to be a real strong confidence that he can win this war, certainly at the beginning, and that in his justification for the invasion of Ukraine, there was a lot of this desire to kind of dominate that part of the world, and an expressed superiority of Russians over Ukrainians. So that's me. That's those, especially those last things on Putin, you need to take with a grain of salt, with some suspicion, because those are just how this framework could be applied. But I'm anxious to kind of dig in and start doing some of this research to explore this framework further. Happy to take questions. Thank you. I can take whatever you. You don't have a normal now, right? Because you don't have a normal way of doing things because there's pandemic.
Please go ahead.
Sure. Questions? Yeah. You.
Thank you, Professor Kaarbo, for presenting project. It was very inspiring, and I have some questions.
Okay.
Mainly two questions. All the factors that we have talked about, like aging, experience, power, belief change, their effects may be, yes, they may make a leader break bad, but they may also make a leader turn out to be a good one. Like increase time horizon of a leader, for example, may make this leader invest more in productive sectors or experience. You also mentioned that maybe the leader may learn how to act strategically and in a manner that increases popularity.
Yep.
So I think that maybe one possible way to find some scope conditions can be on focusing cognitive dissonance, whether the leader experiences some cognitive dissonance after aging or getting more power, and what are the alternative strategies for overcoming these cognitive dissonances. I mean, if breaking bad is a cheaper option, then the leader may break bad, but if it is costly, then he or she may not prefer to do so. So overall then, I think, and since the cost of overcoming cognitive dissonance may be a factor of, maybe a function of regime effects. I mean, democratic settings have different effects and authoritarian settings have different effects. Maybe integrating another level of analysis can help in figuring out the scope conditions where these four factors have positive and negative effects on the leader. So I wonder your opinion, whether that can be a way of finding the scope conditions, whether it would be a fruitful path to follow, and overall about the role of cognitive dissonance. I wonder your opinion.
Okay. Right. Hey, thank you. Great question. So yes, not all leaders will break bad, and there are good things that come from aging, from experience, from learning, from the psychology of power. But the research that I've looked at says that the negative direction is the most likely because of some of the underlying psychological micro-foundation reason. So absolutely, some leaders may break good. I have trouble finding good examples of those. The best ones I can find are maybe leaders that nobody had a lot of faith in at the beginning, that they thought they weren't that great, and then they turned out to be better than expected. So maybe Angela Merkel might be one. There wasn't a lot of high hopes for her leadership. She seemed to get better and more respected over time. Zelensky might be another one. People mocked him for his lack of experience, but we'll have to see how all this works out. But at least he's getting praise for how he's handled some aspects of the intervention now. So absolutely, it may not be that I'll break good or break bad, but I think the negative trend is going to be the more likely one for the reasons that come from this research. On cognitive dissonance, that could be right? So how leaders deal with big life transitions or a big event that shatters their worldview, that may invoke some cognitive dissonance in how they handle it. Personally, I wouldn't put it in terms of the cost of choosing Breaking Bad, of the benefits, because I think for me, it's not really that much of a choice. It is something that happens kind of internally, and a cost-benefit kind of language implies more of a rational act or rational choice, where I'm taking much more of a psychological dimension or perspective on it. Regime type, culture, history, all those things matter. And there may be certain leaders that would break bad under one regime type and wouldn't under another regime type, or certain regime types, for example, that would encourage breaking bad more than others. That's completely true, absolutely. I'm interested in, regardless of those things, what are the psychological reasons that happen in any regime? Because from this research, it says, although breaking bad may be more likely in some of those scope conditions, and that I hope to discover some of those as I do my research, they can happen and do happen across history, culture, regimes. Hope that helps, yeah.
If I have a follow-up question.
Sure, not seeing anybody else.
So I see, so the cost of solving the cognitive dissonance may not be a rational process, so maybe we can focusing on how the cost of solving it may not be the fruitful way. I have one, while we were answering it, one alternative came to my mind. Maybe whether the leader feels cognitive dissonance in the first place can be can offer some promising avenues to focus on, because I think that if a leader gets, for example, on power, changes of power, if a leader gets power in a, gradual manner or suddenly, that would make a difference, I guess, because the level of cognitive dissonance one would feel after the change would be different. And to solve this cognitive dissonance, leaders may act differently.
Yeah. Maybe. So from what I know about cognitive dissonance, it is very subjective. So some leaders who come to power abruptly are going to feel it, others are not. They're going to think, well, I was destined to be that anywhere. There's no dissonance at all. So I take it on board. I think that's a very important thing to look out for. But I would always be looking at it, is the leader experiencing this, which is hard to know, so but put that aside. Is the leader experiencing, not objectively am I kind of imposing that this should be a dissonant situation? Yeah.
Hi, Prof from the Department of International Relations, if I can remember. I was wondering, first of all, thank you very much for the presentation. This is really great, and I was wondering whether you will be, at the end of the paper, whether you will be examining the impact of age, experience, learning, and these psychological factors as latent factors, or so in other words, I'm wondering whether you will engage in a longitudinal analysis, so no matter what the leader was at the beginning, then you're going to measure the change, or are you also planning to conduct a cross-sectional analysis to compare, for example, how age leaders compared to younger leaders act, or how experienced ones, so which one you go for?
Yes. Both. Yeah, so it's probably going to be a book instead of a paper. So, but yeah, so I think the more quantitative would be a kind of cross-sectional, looking at leaders who have served long, have this kind of experience. And those, we do already have those studies. So we know that older leaders tend to, what was it finding? I have to look it up. Older leaders tend to engage in more conflict than younger leaders, and that's true. Regime type is important, but so there are some of those. I would add to those cross-national studies kind of the profiles, right? The scores that we get from personality profiling. So that's one thing I want to do in the more quantitative part. In the case studies, it would be more the longitudinal analysis what happens to this leader. I'll maybe pick 4 or 5 these leaders over time and look at it that way. Is that what you were asking?
Yeah, I'm asking the question because after all, these are all very interesting factors to understand how they behave, but also to some extent, under some designs, these are constant factors.
Yeah.
Like all leaders get age,
Yeah.
all leaders get experience, but you argue that some will break that.
Yeah, yeah.
And I was wondering, aside from age, experience, learning, or these psychological latent factors, what else could trigger some to actually break the bad or some others? So comparing 2 leaders, for example, both are running their countries for 20, 25 years, so they get both aged or experienced, but one is breaking the bad and the other is not. So is it that some psychological factors?
There can be some objective kind of factors of those, but my hunch, and again, since we don't know, we haven't really done this research, but my hunch from this foundation of research that I've looked at already would be that there is something psychological, right? You can have a terminal illness diagnosis, and it's going to affect people differently. So some of the work that's coming out of modern personality and psychology says how we deal with some of those life transitions depends on the stories that we tell ourselves, right? If it's a story that we embrace, then it may break us good. If it's a story that we are bitter about, that could be. So I don't know yet, and there's not enough for me to kind of, I don't want to create such a research design that's so tight that I can't be open to figuring out what some of these things are.
That would be fascinating, though.
Yeah.
It would require an immense coding as well, but that
Yeah.
would be fascinating to see how these existing factors at the beginning change the scene over time. So,
Yeah.
Great.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. I also teach here at the IR department, Seçkin Köster. I have 2 questions. One is broadly concerning a critique coming to individual level analysis-based studies, because I'm myself not a historian. I do IPE and I work on Russia and the post-Soviet space as well. For historians in particular, none of this is surprising, right? We have a short-term bias, we're surprised, we got panicked, but if you look at the long durée, Russian invasion of Ukraine makes a lot of sense. This has happened in the past, right? And Putin tried this multiple times with Georgia, Crimea. So maybe for what you're trying to do, maybe you need a more surprising case, right? In which none of this was expected. Due purely to individual reasons, a leader breaking bad.
Yeah.
Something totally unexpected happened, but I don't really have any case in mind.
Yeah.
So this may not be a very helpful comment, but just thinking about your framework made me wonder if there is any case in which a foreign policy change was totally unexpected and took place as a result of experience, a leader grabbing power, authority, consolidating power, and getting rid of alternative opinions, etc. Because I wonder if it wasn't Putin and someone else ruling Russia at this point of time.
Maybe so. Right. So people that study, those of us who study leaders, always come up against this question, and our answer is never that leaders are the only explanation, but the strongest answer I think I have of that, and we've got lots and lots of research that shows this, is that even those structural factors, the longue durée, the political, economic issues, have to filter through the minds of somebody. There has to be somebody that makes that decision. So maybe the intervention is not so surprising, but the timing or the way that the intervention seemed to be fumbled at the beginning or something like that. That's what leader, personality, individual explanations.
Expectations about the outcome of the war could have changed if it wasn't Putin but someone else.
Could be, right? Or even if you could do the counterfactual of putting Putin in Putin 2008, Putin 2006, he might have, one, not invaded at that time, and two, reacted differently. He might not have been in such a risky frame of mind because of some of these changes that have happened to Putin. So I take your point, but I think, and it's kind of up to us that do leaders, but I would throw it back and say it's up to the historians that look at structures, or up to the IR theorists that look at structures. We all have to think about those alternative explanations and make the case. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this is not a case of Breaking Bad, but I am writing another paper on counterfactual analysis, right? Because we haven't done that explicitly and directly in leadership analysis, and we're making the case: what if Merkel was still in power in Germany at the time the intervention happened? What if Trump was still in power in the U.S.? And what if Zelensky had gone into exile, right? And now those aren't Breaking Bad cases, but those are things. Well, a few might be, but those are we're trying to really isolate the importance of the individual. I don't think we would say that that's completely true for Putin and the invasion, but I mean, Putin made the call, right? That seems to be a consensus about the importance of him, and I just don't see individuals as determined by these historical forces as others do.
Yeah. Can I ask a second
Yeah,
question?
yeah, please.
It's not relevant to my first question. So is your framework only relevant for leaders who stay in power for a long time? The reason I'm asking this is I have in mind a leader who broke bad in his third year in office, the occupation of Iraq, George W. Bush.
Yeah.
Does that count?
It does.
Is it an entirely different story?
No, I think so. So those were the smaller pictures at the beginning there. I'll get back there. So, oops. Never mind. I do think some leaders break bad early on in their tenure. So I do want to look at that. I think some leaders may have some of these bad characteristics at the beginning. So we know Trump, for example, was very high on distrust, like 4 standard deviations above the norm on distrust, even when he just started. I think he got worse, right? I think those bad characteristics made things get worse in terms of his governing. So I want to be open at this point to looking at long-serving. I'm just interested in time, and time can be from moment 1 to moment 2. We have a little bit of that, but we don't have, and we have a little bit of first year, third year, or first term, second term in some of our analysis, but we don't have that much. Do you have an intervention?
No, not intervention, but we're almost over time, so maybe 1 or 2 more questions.
Okay, I've got 2 hands here. There and then there.
All right, my name is Gozalhan, and it's my third year in this department, international relations. So my question is, how does gender relate to Breaking Bad? So let's have 2 leaders like Milosevic or Thatcher and compare them while seeing them Breaking Bad. There's a trend between gender, maybe? Like, will this relate to your study?
It does, and I've gotten that question a lot. I don't know yet. Some of the research that's coming out of psychology, which is really, really pretty systematic, is not finding a big gender difference between leaders who break bad and leaders who don't. Maybe how they break bad might be gendered. And I think it's even less different when you get to the level of the leader of the country, because they've been socialized so much into a masculine type of world that even female leaders are going to break bad in a gendered masculine way. So I want to look at both female and male leaders. It's hard to find a feminine context for a world leader to get out of just the, male-female binary and look at gender issues more. But Breaking Bad, I mean, have you watched the show? It feels very masculine, but I think women can break bad in that same kind of way. And my my hunch is that they do, especially at the top levels. But we'll see. Your question?
My question was pretty much the same thing based on gender, especially after I saw the picture of Margaret Thatcher. I thought gender is definitely going to be one of the variables, and not being it here, I was going to ask why, but you answered it, I suppose.
Yeah. So I think, I mean, the story on Thatcher is that she was she was judged in a very gendered context, but also, ruled in a way that tried to overcome her gender standpoint. So we'll see. Yeah. Is that it, or?
Maybe one more.
Okay. Yep. And then if there's any others, I'm happy to talk afterwards.
Yeah, I was wondering, when you operationalize these variables, how do you distinguish in terms of measurement between experience and learning?
Yeah.
Because learning is about how leaders' beliefs change. Where do beliefs come from? They come from experience.
They may, yeah. So again, it's a fair point, and I've had to think about that when I wrote the article. But I try to be very specific because they're drawing on different literature, so I wanted some kind of different kind of label for them. And so when I talk about experience, it's not kind of past experience; it's experience on the job, right? As they are learning their role, and so that's my narrow point there. And so I would look at how long they've ruled, right? That would be a measurement that's independent of how I would measure beliefs, which is looking at their personality profiles and how they talk about the world and seeing beliefs. So I have independent measures of those for sure, and in my mind, I can separate them conceptually as well. Yeah.
Maybe with the exception of the points in which there is an intersection between the leader during his stay or her stay in office and the real change that happens on the job.
So and that's a bigger, all those four things intersect, right? And so I'm not interested in creating, back to the question of research design, and creating a study that tries to, which is it? Is it age or is it experience? I'm just saying all these things are pointing in the same trajectory. And I may be able to discover which is important for a single leader, but I'm not interested in pitting them against each other, even though I do have separate measures for them. All right? Thank you. Oh, my goodness. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh, I have to write the book now, so thank you.